we're now going to hear from Carol Bartle and Katrina Biggs. They're from New Zealand. And Carol Bartle has a health background, including midwifery. Her major work and interests include women's health, ethics, and human rights, climate change and health, breastfeeding and infant feeding politics, and women in prison, particularly mothers with babies in prison. And Katrina Biggs, I will give you her bio at the end because I haven't got it written down here. They're going to give an update from New Zealand and also talking about issues with language changes and the issues related to the loss of sex-based language in maternity, birth, breastfeeding and women's health.
Hi from Aotearoa New Zealand. I'm Carol Bartle. This is Katrina Biggs. We've got a session for you talking about what's actually happening over here. My background is in women, infants and children's health, and I originally trained as a nurse and a midwife in the UK. Since moving over to New Zealand, I've worked in a wide range of roles, but always with a focus on women's health and well-being. So this session's really in two parts. I'm going to do a sort of a short romp through what's been happening over here in Aotearoa New Zealand, and then Katrina's going to give you an update from Speak Up for Women New Zealand with an overview of some of the organisations and what's been happening here. I think that personally I've been sleepwalking a little for a few years, because the first time I became aware of what was going on was in 2021 when the College of Midwives here, who had postponed a conference that had Millie Hill as a keynote speaker, started to receive some backlash when they were promoting the conference again. So as you're probably already aware, because I know there's been a session or a couple of sessions before for WDI looking at this issue, the petition was started to remove Millie Hill as a keynote speaker, and it accused her of being a transphobic keynote speaker, which of course she is not. And it suggested that the conference would be unsafe if she was there, which is that she poses immediate risk and harm towards the LGBTQIA+ community. Then a counter petition was started, which addressed the defamatory statements against Millie, and there's still people signing both of them because both of them are still up there. When Millie first started writing and tweeting responses to the attacks in the UK, because of course she was being attacked over there quite vigorously as well as in New Zealand, I sort of realised I needed to get up to speed a bit and do some reading. So I got up to speed quickly. My library, thanks to all this, rapidly expanded with books by Kathleen Stock and Helen Joyce, Julie Bindell, Jane Clare Jones, Holly Lawford Smith and Abigail Shrier. I also reread 1984 because it seems pretty relevant at the moment. So what's been happening here? This is a very quick overview. So we have had the conversion therapy bill passed here. It causes a lot of concern, of course, to counsellors and therapists in terms of what seemed to be support for an unquestioning affirmation model, rather than counsellors and therapists being able to employ a more therapeutic approach in some situations. I think probably in the minds of people, the gay conversion therapy, which of course is appalling and a criminal assault, was mixed up in people's minds with what Stella O'Malley describes as gender exploratory therapy. So this had a lot of submissions and lots of the select committee, lots of feedback from both sides. And then after that, we had the Births, Deaths, Marriages and Relationships Registration Bill. This comes into law next year, and then we'll see how the removal of sex in law and public policy plays out. Changing the protections afforded to women to apply to males who identify as women effectively removes these protections for women, of course. So we're all rather worried about where this is going to go. So the New Zealand media has been relatively quiet in terms of any critique of this or any in-depth exploration of these changes that have happened and what they mean for around 50% of the population. And recently there's been a full-on push to promote inclusive language in pregnancy as posing no issue for women. And this is a recent article from the New Zealand Herald, 4th of September, where it talked about how people using pregnancy and birthing spaces, words like mother are everywhere, the dysphoria is triggered by the unnecessary injection of femininity, etc., and femininely suggestive decor, for example. So at the same time that the article on the previous slide was published, there was also a 3-page colour article in the Sunday special, helpfully telling us that we're not being erased, which really didn't make me feel any better personally, and I didn't feel comforted by that. And I think it's interesting that we get, again, these statements saying that the benefits of language inclusivity, there's research to show this, whereas in fact, there is actually not really any research and nothing explaining the so-called benefits at all. Organisations over here have stopped referring to women. Here's just a small selection of examples. It is, of course, all about people. Not all periods have had periods of women, not all women have periods, etc. People may have told you only people who have babies can have an IUD, etc. And the same issue with cervical screening. We, of course, recognise that many people, including, of course, a lot of women, have had experience of healthcare that have been less than optimal. And we, of course, agree that this should be addressed and remedied. But I personally don't think that the answer to this is removing the language of women, mothers, and breastfeeding. I think we should aim to respect everyone, including the women who would prefer to be called women, pregnant women, and breastfeeding mothers. The Ministry of Health have changed their language without any obvious consultation that we're aware of. It looks like they started off in March 2022 with trying to use what's called, of course, the additive approach. Then by about June 2022, in this long-acting reversible contraception training principles and standards, they don't mention women at all, or interestingly, the vagina. They do talk about inserting a speculum, but don't actually mention where it goes to get to the cervix. There are 19 mentions of person and 7 persons. And the trainee greets the person and appropriately identifies people by name. Then we had the standards for abortion counselling, which was in August 2022. Women are mentioned once, but then you couldn't really get away with that, not doing that, because it was in reference to CEDAW. So that's how that goes. So abortion counselling is intended to provide therapeutic support to people who are considering having or have had an abortion. And I think the change from women and people in March 2022 through to where we are now in August 2022 shows quite clearly what the expressed concerns have been with the additive approach, like guess which bit gets dropped quite quickly, in fact. This is a bit of an attempt to try and work out some numbers in terms of births. We've only got data available in Australia, and looking at the number of births in Australia, in 2018, 22 births were reported in women who identified as men. So theoretically, even if the numbers have grown to 29, say, in 2020, this is still a tiny fraction of the births in Australia. So if we translated the figures to here in Aotearoa New Zealand, based on 60,000 births annually, that would equate to 6 births per year, which is, I think, interesting in terms of all the changes we're making to language. So I've added this pamphlet here, which is about supporting transgender and non-binary parents. It's produced by PADA, which is the Perinatal Anxiety and Depression Aotearoa, a really great organisation. I think it's essential that we do, as a health worker again, that we do have evidence-based, understandable and accessible health information out there for everyone that addresses their own health needs. So I am supportive of information availability, but this bit here was particularly perplexing to me and I think potentially misleading. This is comparing the increase in transgender and non-binary visibility to the incidence and visibility of people who are left-handed. It talks about how children in the early 20th century were discouraged from using their left hand due to religious beliefs. And of course, they were punished. And then once the beliefs changed and they could use their right hand, or their left hand without punishment, the number of left-handed adults grew. I think that obviously stopping children using their left hand is not okay, but what could happen to children now can't be compared to that. Potentially irreversible damage, to quote Abigail Schreier. As a health worker, again, it's really important that we have clear communication, which is a lot of the problem with this losing the sex language. Understanding what the information says is paramount. It has to be understandable, it has to be effective, otherwise your message is completely compromised. So what's happening to our language in healthcare is a concern. It is respectful to address people individually by whatever they wish to call themselves. But there are ways of doing this which do not erase women and also make things understandable for people who've got English as a second language and a whole range of issues that are embedded in there. So a group of very well-respected researchers based in various places, a few in Australia, some in England, published this article in early 2022. And some of you will be very familiar with this article because it was quite a seminal article in terms of what it was saying. It was about effective communication about pregnancy, birth, lactation, breastfeeding, newborn care, and the importance of sex language. So Gribble et al. Actually highlighted the risks of desexing language when you describe female reproduction. And they recognized the lack of consideration of the ethics of these changes. And I do recommend getting a copy of this article if you haven't read it. It's free to download. And there's also some really good supplementary information to download too, which shows you different organizations, their approaches or not approaches to actually addressing this issue. These language changes on this slide, of course, will not be new to most of you, of course. But I think when you look at that slide, you see all the words that are being replaced with person, people, families, mother and mothers replaced with parent, etc. Body parts, as we know, birthers, vagina owners, etc. And even non-males or non-men. I think it's also, as it says there, notable to see that when it comes to matters related to males, we don't really see this desexing language happening. So my area of work, as I said before, is actually in women's reproductive health and maternity. So these changes in terms of data and getting data that we understand in the future and also research are really of concern to me. And listening to women in New Zealand and overseas, they are unhappy with these changes, but often too intimidated to express their concerns. And their voices, rights and wishes are disrespected and disregarded. So this image, and you can see it's me because I actually wore my red glasses tonight, so there would be no difficulty in identifying me. This image and message was created in 2019, funnily enough. It was posted first on Facebook in 2019 and seen by a lot of people. And it was a quote from a book chapter actually that I wrote about climate change and infant feeding. So it was in a book by edited by Lorna Davis, Ray Dellenbach and Mary Kensington about sustainability, midwifery and birth. And so in my chapter, I also referenced Marion Nestle, who had written a chapter for a different book. And the reason I use this quote, which says it's important to restore breastfeeding relationships to the people to whom breastfeeding belongs, women, so they can breastfeed if they want to, when they want to, and where they want to, is because Marion Nestle, who wrote a chapter which is entitled How Neoliberalism Ruins Traditional Diets and Health. And I consider that breastfeeding is really a traditional diet in that sense, and it belongs to women. And it was in a book called Eating NAFTA, Trade, Food Policies and the Destruction of Mexico. So Marion was talking about tortilla, and she said that she uses the tortilla for a metaphor for change. And she said the key is to restore its relationship to the people to whom it historically belongs, so they can eat tortillas if, when and where they want to. So that's where this actual quote came from. And of course, it caused some negative feedback in 2022, unfortunately, and it incited none in 2019. And this was put on the page for World Breastfeeding Week. It was just reused, which is why it says on the bottom, the Step Up for Breastfeeding message, which was the message for this year. And the comments underneath this particular image had to be turned off, for the obvious reasons. And I think this next slide I'm putting up is something that politicians should think about. And I know that this is coming through in lots of places, like, for Labour, what is a woman? And politicians being asked these questions. So I think, this was an old slide again for World Breastfeeding Week. And my friend Alison, this was her daughter, Olivia, with her granddaughter, Iris. And it says, this World Breastfeeding Week, we'd like politicians everywhere to remember the one simple act with which women have the power to change lives. And breastfeeding advocates refer to this activity as voting. This is just to celebrate the joy of books, just to relieve things. And I think it's really true. It's great to read a book or write something, and then people don't put obnoxious comments on the last page, which is really good. And I think we're all used to social media now and some of the backlash that women are getting. So I just wanted to just very quickly say, we have an organization here, Inside Out, which is probably the closest thing we've got to mermaids, which you have in the UK. Inside Out works with youth, whānau, schools and communities. They have a range of things. They have work in schools, they do resources, etc. And I think Katrina's going to talk more about this further on. We also, of course, have now got Rainbow Storytime. So Drag Queen Storytime has arrived in New Zealand and is in our libraries for preschoolers and children. The Ministry of Health information, this is one of the most concerning bit because this page I don't think has been updated. since 2020. And despite the Ministry of Health receiving numerous letters of concern about what this says, it still says that blockers are a safe and fully reversible medicine that may be used from early puberty, etc. So this is causing a little bit of a concern. I have added this slide. This is from the Accident Compensation Corporation, which is our New Zealand Crown entity. It's responsible for administering our no-fault accidental injury compensation. So we're looking now at the moment at extending cover for maternal birth injuries. But I thought it was quite amusing to see this little bit at the bottom, because it says it extends cover to parents injured during labour and birth. And I think that as an ex-midwife, it did make me giggle a bit, because I had visions of fathers fainting in the birth room and hurting themselves, and then they'd have to be covered as well, because that just shows again how ridiculous this language ends up being and how difficult it is to interpret. So the voices of people who'd like to discuss these issues are generally silenced, and this CATA, the Child and Adolescent Therapists Association, recently provided the most amazing day, a seminar. As soon as they started advertising the seminar, they got attacked. Stella O'Malley was one of the speakers, and they also had two lawyers speaking who were interpreting the law changes for concerned therapists who wonder how they're going to practice. So unfortunately, they had to come out and make statements about what it wasn't about, because they were accused of all range of things, really. And all they're really interested in is looking at mental health issues, looking at accurate information based on science and evidence, etc. So we got a lot of things in the media. The New Zealand Association of Counsellors immediately put something out there saying they were concerned about the conference because they thought it wasn't going to reflect best practices. They thought it was going to pathologise transgender people, etc., etc. Of course, none of this was true at all. And of course, they tried to disrupt the conference as well. So some good news really to end my part of the session. We've at last got a measured, important article suggesting that New Zealand needs to review their use of puberty blockers. This is in the New Zealand Listener, that's just this week. So this is a really good, well-researched and thoughtful article about something we should be looking at. So I think that the opening sentences reflect the situation in New Zealand quite well, where Charlotte Paul, who wrote this, said she was writing this article because my colleagues pleaded with me to do so. My younger colleagues in particular know they can't speak out because it could potentially damage their reputations. So that's the end of my little piece. And I'm going to hand over to Katrina now. And then when Katrina finishes, I'm going to show you a few more slides of the various organisations in New Zealand who are working in the same space as we are. So over to Katrina.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, I'm Katrina Biggs, and I'm the co-spokeswoman for Speak Up for Women New Zealand. Thank you for having me here and the opportunity to tell you a bit about us in general and a little bit about the situation here in New Zealand with gender identity ideology. Now, first of all, may I show you our wonderful t-shirt, if you can see that. Oh. This was co-designed by, I beg your pardon, this was designed by the co-spokeswoman Suzanne Levy. Okay, Speak Up for Women was formed in 2018 around someone's kitchen table, in a manner of speaking, to campaign against the sex self-ID bill being sneaked through Parliament, just like it was in about every country where it's been passed into law. Speak Up for Women operates as a small leadership team with some amazing supporters, but we don't have a paid membership as such. There are also some incredible gender-critical women here in New Zealand who work off their own bat on some issues and together on others. Needless to say, the level of hostility has been, and still can be, eye-watering. The Speak Up for Women leadership team and the supporters who wrote letters and spoke out against sex self-ID are clearly terrible, bigoted women for not wanting men in women's spaces in sports, even those men who say they're women. Despite a High Court ruling in 2021 that Speak Up for Women could not rationally be described as a hate group, a mayoral candidate still alluded to our group being that very thing in a recent public podcast. The bill did get put on hold the first time around, but got resurrected when the Labour government got back into power in 2020. And eventually it was passed into law in December 2021. That's the bill that was passed into law. The law will actually be passed in about mid next year. During the campaign against it, we were told that a Department of Internal Affairs would conduct a statutory review of the sex self-ID law 5 years after it was passed. But recent information has revealed that will only be a review of the processes, not the impacts. That wasn't the impression we got when the review was mentioned, so now we need to go back and see what was actually said and in what context. Meantime, initial approaches to the Department of Internal Affairs to work with them to collect stories of the impacts of sex self-ID have not exactly been received with a great idea response, so we will continue working on making further approaches there. Those aforementioned terrible bigoted women are very much our heroines. Their campaigning and raising public awareness about the sex self-ID bill gave rise to a clause being added which amounted to saying that a birth certificate wasn't necessarily the ultimate proof of a person's sex, and that other factors could be taken into consideration. The other factors are not named, so this remains to be tested, although a beard and a male body complete with penis might possibly be considered other factors. Who knows? As I said, it remains to be tested. Speak Up for Women is currently working on providing some written clarity for service providers who appear to have been confused by our Human Rights Commission's advice about discrimination based on gender. Single-sex spaces are still allowable by law, but the waters around this have become so muddied with the conflation of sex and gender and our public service policies, both written and that which has seeped into the narrative, that confusion reigns. Not to mention the aggression from gender identity ideologues and activists who pile on anyone who strays from how they say things should be. This frightens most service providers into submission. We've seen this in other countries too. After 3 years of intense campaigning and being on the receiving end of so much hostility from activists, local councillors and local body government, politicians and members of parliament, for the crime of not wanting to protect women's rights and safeties, the women who led this campaign were campaigned out and the reins were handed over to a new leadership team. We have broadened our focus from the single issue of sex self-ID and now advocate for the wider issue that sex does matter in some instances, and when it matters, it really matters. After a hiatus while the new leadership team was being established, Speak Up for Women is now working on building up public visibility again. We know we're succeeding because some people are getting very upset with us once more. Since those early days when women were caught napping because we thought our rights and safeties were secure and could only be built upon, not pulled down, we've pretty much followed in the footsteps of all the other countries which have been captured by gender identity ideology. The mainstream media here in New Zealand are captured right up to the hilt. However, some smaller, but still well-known media have begun dipping their toes into presenting a side of this issue that's not all about following the ideologues and activists' playbook. Admittedly, it's been a bit like pulling teeth getting here, but there does seem to have been a small breakthrough, fingers crossed. The fact that careers and livelihoods have been on the line for those who didn't play by their ideologues and activists' playbook may have had a small bearing on this media silence, you think? The top brass within all our public service and government departments also appear to be captured, as well as many of the rank and file. Although there are some secret dissenters amongst them, once again, they mostly keep silent from the fear of risking their jobs and livelihoods. New Zealand's own Ministry for Women doesn't define what a woman is. The chief executive said that very thing just a few months ago. I don't know of any other ministry within our government that doesn't define what it exists for. A Ministry for Women is fully trans women are woman, but doesn't actually explain how it is that any man who says he's a woman is one. They can't seem to provide or point to any of their policies that explicitly state trans women are women, and neither can they provide anything that shows when or how the decision was made to incorporate men who genderify as women under the umbrella of the Ministry for Women. Not only is their Ministry for Women captured, the National Council for Women here in New Zealand is too. In all the text on the home page of their website, they don't mention the word woman once, apart from in their title. We know that there are many good people working in our ministries and organisations, but gender identity ideology seems to have made inroads in ways that they're unable to combat, should they wish to. A little while ago, our Ministry of Education released refreshed relationships and sexuality education guidelines. These have some very good guidelines in them, but also have some disturbing guidelines which pay homage to gender identity ideology, even for very young children. This resulted in a group of women creating a website called Resist Gender Education to give alternative guidance for parents who are aghast at some of the ideas around gender identity ideology being pushed onto both primary and secondary school children. For example, the Ministry of Education are supporting guidelines from rainbow organisations such as Inside Out, who advise that any boy who says he's a girl should be allowed to use the girls' facilities, play on girls' sports teams at school, and sleep with them when there is an away trip. There is no apparent consideration given to girls in this advice. It is totally a one-way street. And even though the Ministry of Education advises that all students' needs must be considered, it seems to support an organisation that ignores that advice. The exception is if the trip involves an overnight stay on a marae, a communal Māori complex, and then respect must be shown towards marae protocols if sleeping arrangements are separated by sex on the marae. One of the ongoing issues at the moment is the matter of the Christchurch City Council implementing a women's session at the new Linwood Pool, and then stating that it includes a trans woman and people who identify as being women. Not only does it include them, but welcomes them. In other words, any man who genderfies as a woman is welcome, but boys over 6 years old aren't. This is astonishing when we dig down and discover how much the council bent over backwards to make a place where women felt safe and secure away from men. This included the installation of blinds that could be lowered over the pool's windows during the women's session, and a warning that in the event of an emergency, it was possible that a woman may be attended to by a male paramedic. During the early stages of creating a women's session at Linwood Pool, the Christchurch City Council had discussed splitting the women's session in a way that trans women and people who identify as being women would have a time slot where they didn't mix with women. In other words, there would be a time slot strictly for women only, and another time slot for women, trans women, and people who identify as being women. Excuse me. This was what we asked for when engaging with the council after the pool was opened, and we found out that they'd ended up making the women's session a free for all for anyone who called themselves woman. Upon further investigation, the council appeared to have changed their mind from their original stance after consulting with Qtopia, Christchurch's rainbow organisation. Despite the council's claims that they consulted widely about the women's session, we can't see evidence that the community was consulted on the particular point of including those men who self-ID as women. This is still an ongoing matter with the Christchurch City Council, and we still hope to resolve it. Thank you to everyone who is in with us in this. Now I'll hand back to Carol.
So we're just going to finish really with a few slides which show you some of the organisations that are active over in Australia and New Zealand. There's a really good organisation, Save Women's Sports in Australasia. And I should say that we're talking too fast, obviously, for most of you to read most of the things that are on the slides, but of course you'll be able to see it, slow it down at some point and read it properly. This is Save Women's Sports again, the rest of their webpage. It's a really good website. We also have Women's Liberation Aotearoa, we have Broadsheet, which is New Zealand's feminist magazine, which is active again. It's a great Facebook page, except they haven't posted anything since the 18th of August, so we're not quite sure what's happened to them at the moment. There's a Coalition for Biological Reality, Australia and New Zealand. It's a Facebook page. There's Lesbian Action for Visibility and Aotearoa, which is LAVA. We've also got, of course, now LGB Alliance in New Zealand, which is just recently set up here, which is really great. There's also a website called Fully Informed that documents the case against puberty blockers and highlights alternatives. Mana Wahine Korero, which is a really good page with quite a few videos, which are really of interest.
For Māori women.
For Māori women, yeah. Arguments with Friends.
Substack.
Which is a Substack. The Ministry Has Fallen, which is also a Substack, and this is about the Ministry for Education. And also No Conflict, they said. Is that a Substack too?
No, that's a website that collects stories.
Oh, that's a website that collects stories, yeah. So there's a bit that they want to, that invites you to send stories in. And that's the end of the organisations and the end of our session. So thank you very much for having us. It's been a great pleasure and a privilege
Thank
to
you.
join in. Thank you.